and welcome to this talk about fever. My name is Dr. Kye Peven, and I want to spend a few minutes telling you why fever is actually a really good thing. Many people, when they start to get a fever, or when a loved one starts to get a fever, become worried and think that maybe they need to do something about this fever. And though that's true, it might not be what you think. When I hear that someone has mounted a fever, my initial response is almost always that I feel really good about it because their body is responding appropriately to some kind of infectious illness. So fever is a very, very important response to infection. Before we jump in to everything about fever, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a naturopathic and Chinese medicine doctor, and I currently practice in Seattle, Washington. I'm the clinic director of the Whole Systems Healthcare Seattle Clinic. I'm also the clinic operations director for Whole Systems Healthcare as a larger organization, which means that I oversee the other clinics in our organization in other parts of the country. Today, we're going to start with what exactly fever is. How do we define fever? Where it comes from? How long has this immune response been with us? What happens with the immune system during fever? And then basic guidelines, how to manage a fever, what to do if your loved one has a fever. And then specifically, what's a low body temperature? What's a high body temperature? And what to do in those kinds of situations. So first, how do we define fever? Fever is an increase in the temperature of the body as a response to infectious disease. That is the most basic definition. Body temperature can also go up for other reasons, such as heat stroke or hyperthyroid, other types of endocrine issues, metabolic disorders, or cancer. These other causes of fever are different from fever that is due to infectious disease, and when it's due to these other causes, it needs to be treated differently. We're not going to talk about that in this talk today. What does fever represent? So we talked about what it is, but what is it like? Why do we map a fever at a slightly bigger picture level? Fever is a process that helps us regulate our immune systems, and really it represents an ability to adapt and change to a shifting environment. It helps us to forge appropriate relationships with our environment and within ourselves. There's plenty of research showing that if children's immune systems aren't exposed to various pathogens, they don't develop appropriately, and they end up experiencing more immune issues like allergies all the way up to autoimmune conditions. We are surrounded by bacteria and viruses. We live with them, we live in them, they live in us. And we need to sort of figure out, each of us individually has to figure out how to develop the appropriate relationship with all of these other organisms. Fever is one way in which we do that. Fever has been with us for a very long time. It likely evolved hundreds of millions of years ago, because all the animals that we've studied show signs of a fever response. In warm-blooded animals like ourselves, mammals and birds, for instance, we generate the heat from within us due to our ability to create heat. But even in cold-blooded animals, such as reptiles or fish, they, when confronted with infectious disease, will attempt to raise their body temperatures through their behavior, such as moving into the sun, trying to warm themselves up through their surroundings. And when you stop in a laboratory scenario, when you're studying this fever response, if you stop the animals from attempting to raise their body temperature, they tend to die more often. Even plants can try to raise the temperatures of their leaves, of their tissues, in order to fight an infection. So this is an old process that we've been using for a very long time. What happens though? How does the fever affect us? There's two sides to the immune system. The first side is our innate immune system. This innate immune system responds in the same way to pathogens, no matter what the pathogen is. The skin is an element of our innate immune system because it blocks pathogens from getting into the body. Mucous membranes, like the linings of the nose, of the sinuses, in your mouth, in your throat, these mucous membranes are covered with certain types of proteins that have evolved to stop the growth and spread of pathogens. So, and white blood cells as well have innate responses to pathogens that don't depend on what specific pathogen it is. And fever enhances all of this. Fever increases the movement of white blood cells to an area of infection. It increases the production of white blood cells in our bone marrow. It increases the ability of white blood cells to directly stop pathogens by destroying them, by eating them. They're white blood cells called macrophages that eat pathogens. It helps the white blood cells to generate the inflammatory compounds that are used to kill and attack invading pathogens. And it also increases the sensitivity of white blood cells to pathogens. If the pathogens cannot be noticed, if the white blood cells are not aware of them, then they can't fight them. They can't, change them at all. So it increases their sensitivity. The second part of the immune system is our adaptive immunity. The adaptive immune system creates a targeted response to a specific pathogen. This is what a lot of us think about when we hear the word antibody. This is also generally speaking, the side of the immune system that is stimulated by vaccines, which is why vaccines contain a little piece of the specific pathogen. This process takes a few days to spin up, to activate, especially when we are confronted with something that is new, like a novel virus, something we've never been exposed to before. It takes 3 to 7 days for this adaptive immunity to get going and start producing enough antibodies to shut down the infection. Fever speeds up this process. And so really helps the adaptive immune system to mature, to respond and be more prepared to take on the infection. General fever guidelines. The first is diet. A lot of times people lose their appetites when they get sick. And this is for an important reason. It's because fighting an infection and mounting this immune response takes a lot of energy. So does digestion. Digestion takes an enormous amount of energy. And so the appetite goes away because energy is needed for the immune system. And so the first general principle is that you don't want to feed a fever. Only eat if you are hungry. And don't force yourself to eat if you are not hungry, because this is going against what the body really needs at this time. If you are going to eat, keep it light. Eat minimally seasoned whole foods, fruits, vegetables, beans, grains, maybe some nuts. But be careful and stay away from really heavy foods, really fatty foods, fried foods, foods that normally might kind of, sit like a lump in your stomach. Really avoid junk food or highly processed food because they're devoid of many of the nutrients that we need. And no refined sugar, and this goes very much with staying away from junk food. A lot of processed food and junk food has sugar, a lot of refined sugar in it, and no alcohol. Food should be warm and cooked. Even fruit can be lightly steamed, except for juicy fruits. So fruits like apples, lightly steamed or lightly cooked, makes them more digestible. It's much easier to digest cooked food than it is to digest raw food. And it's also easier on the digestion when food is warm, because when food is cold, the digestive system is deep in the body, and energy must be expended to warm up that food. It tends to put a greater burden on the digestive system, and especially when you're sick, you want to make digestion as easy as possible. Hydration is also critical. You want to make sure you stay hydrated with room temperature or warm fluids at all times. Same thing with cold food. Cold drinks tend to harm the digestive system, and really I don't recommend drinking anything cold, especially when you're sick. If you're losing fluids through sweating, through vomiting, through something like diarrhea, make sure you compensate by drinking more. There's a few ways to sort of get a sense of how dehydrated you might be. If you haven't urinated in several hours, 3 to 4 hours, or you notice that your urine is darker than usual, you're probably dehydrated. It's a good time to up your fluid intake. There's also the skin, what's called the skin turgor test. You take a pinch of skin on the hand or arm and pull up like that. If the pinch stays up for more than 1 second, that's often a sign that you're dehydrated. This is not an exact test, doesn't work as well, especially for elderly folks, but it's a good quick test to see if you need to drink more or not. Because alcohol and coffee are diuretics, they actually deplete fluids, it's a good idea to stay away from them if you can. In terms of medication, generally speaking, I recommend avoiding ibuprofen, Tylenol, or other anti-fever medications, and I would recommend that you do so as well, unless you've been specifically advised to take them by your physician or healthcare provider. These medications shut down the inflammatory response and suppress the immune system, which is exactly what you need in order to fight the infection. They may help you feel good temporarily. They might take away some of the symptoms and the discomfort of being sick, but you're actually working against the natural processes of the body, and it can extend or lengthen the time of sickness and potentially set you up for more risk of chronic inflammatory conditions down the road. Rest is paramount. Like I said before, it takes a lot of energy to mount immune response. So you want to give as much energy as possible to the body. There's a reason that we often feel fatigued when we are sick. It's because the body needs that rest because it's spending the energy on the inside. If you can, take time off work and don't go about your normal activities, especially physical activities. Mental activities count too. But if you continue to work or be active, this can often prolong the illness, and it'll take you longer to recover and make recovery more difficult. So let's talk a little bit about temperature, because that's what a fever is at temperature. Generally speaking, it's agreed that fever starts at about 104 degrees Fahrenheit. This doesn't mean that 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit is a good temperature for fever. In naturopathic medicine, we want the fever to be in the right range, and this range is approximately 101 to 103 degrees. Because if it's too low, then the immune system is not as effective as it could be. And if it's too high, then more sort of risky things or dangerous things can start to occur. And that high temperature is about 104 degrees for adults and 106 degrees for children. Children typically can tolerate higher temperatures. This might seem high, but actually the body needs to go even higher for, generally speaking, for permanent issues to occur. You may have heard that really high fevers can cause brain damage, especially in children. That typically doesn't happen until 108 degrees. So 106, even for children, is still below the threshold for danger. In addition to objective temperature readings from a thermometer, how the person feels is really important. And often, with most sort of fevers that are not serious, the way the person feels is more important than what the thermometer says. If a person is feeling cold, if a person is feeling hot, and also if a person is feeling really ill or they look really ill. When you look at someone, you say, oh, geez, you don't look good, you look really sick. They probably are. We're good at noticing that in other people. So take that as the most important finding. If someone looks really sick, then that's important. I do want to say, however, that in modern times, it's much more common for fever temperatures to be too low as opposed to too high. So let's talk about what happens and when temperature is too low. The best way to tell if temperature is too low in a fever is if the sick person feels cold, or even if they are especially sensitive to cold. This includes being sensitive to breezes and drafts because the airflow, wind over the body, wicks away heat very quickly. If a person is feeling cold, then they probably need to be warmed up. Secondarily, if the temperature of the fever, as measured by a thermometer, is less than 101 degrees, then that's kind of a low-grade fever, and they could probably do to be warmed up. But generally speaking, it's more important to see how the person feels. If a person is shivering or has chills, this is a sign the body is attempting to generate heat, because shivering helps to increase our body temperature. This is a sign that they need to be warmed up. The first step in increasing or sort of supporting a fever response is to make sure that you don't lose heat. So make sure you bundle up, wear a couple of extra layers, and especially you want to wear a hat and a scarf. A lot of the body's heat gets lost through the head, especially the top of the head, and a hat will help prevent that. And the neck and throat region is an area where it is said in Chinese medicine that wind can enter the body. And many people will find that the neck and throat area becomes especially sensitive to cold and breezes when they are sick. So scarves are a very, very helpful article of clothing at this time. The next thing that you can do is take a hot bath or a hot shower. Baths are better because there's more heat that you can absorb, but if you don't have a bathtub, showers work well as also. You can also drink hot drinks like hot herbal tea or hot soup, and this will help you warm up from the inside. If it's very difficult to warm up, then you can take a hot bath and drink hot beverages at the same time. This is a great way to really bring up the body temperature and start to feel actually more comfortable and not cold. Of course, you don't want to increase the body temperature until it's too high. So when do you cool off? Well, like in the last slide, you want to go by how you feel, how the person feels. If you start to feel warm and you're not cold anymore, especially if you start to feel warm and you start to sweat a little bit, that's a sign that you don't need the heating therapies anymore. Sweating is an important part of the immune response and often accompanies the what we call the breaking of the fever, when the body temperature stops rising and starts to drop again. That signifies that the immune response is moving towards resolution and is a very good sign. However, even if you reach that point, if a person reaches that point, do not allow yourself to become chilled. Make sure you stay bundled up and that you don't allow that body heat that you've generated to be taken away, to be whisked away. So be careful with drafts, be careful with sudden temperature changes, moving from a warm into a cold room, and make sure that you have plenty of layers and blankets available. And lastly, it's very important to stay hydrated. As body temperature increases, you need more fluids in order to help process that. You also need to make sure there are plenty of fluids for getting rid of metabolic waste products that are generated during the fever response. So what if temperatures are too high? First of all, in addition to the specific thermometer readings of about 104 degrees for adults and 106 degrees for children, it's also really important to assess how the person looks and how they feel. If they look really sick, if they're really out of it, maybe they're delirious, they can't really answer questions very well. Most people will start to become a little worried at this point, and rightly so. Other times, sort of causes for concern when to start thinking about excessively high temperatures is if a person is getting dehydrated because they can't retain fluids, or they're losing more fluids than they can take in, and you can use those metrics of dehydration to gauge whether a person is becoming dehydrated or not. These are all times to think about maybe bringing down the fever one way or another. At home, the best way to bring a fever down is with what's called a neutral bath, which is a bath at about skin temperature, which is 91 to 93 degrees Fahrenheit. Do not put a person with a high fever into a cold or an ice bath. The sudden cold against the skin will force the superficial blood vessels to constrict. And what that does is force the blood deeper into the body. This can actually raise the internal body temperature, which is the opposite of what we want to do right now. The neutral bath will sort of gently extract heat from the body without shutting down the circulatory system like that. You can also use cold cloths on the forehead, placing a washcloth that has been soaked in cold water on the forehead. And that can be very helpful because the brain and the nervous system is the most sensitive to high body temperature. And by keeping the head cool, you'll be able to allow the rest of the body to kind of work through this process while protecting the brain and nervous system. Especially if the person seems really sick, out of it, delirious, or they're becoming dehydrated because they can't keep fluids down. This is when you need to call either your healthcare provider or urgent care, because they may need to go to the hospital. So in this talk, we discussed how fever really is an important process. It's been with us for a long time. It's present in all different kinds of animals, and from a naturopathic standpoint, the fever response needs to be regulated, not suppressed. So doing what you can to allow the body to complete the fever process, bringing the temperature up if it's too low, and bringing the temperature down if it's too high, and providing the body with what it needs in order to mount a successful immune response. Thank you for listening.